In this lecture, let's start setting the action type for our actions. From my experience, students tend to get confused by this concept. I'll try my best to explain it. If you have questions, be sure to ask in the Q&A section of the course. Here we go. An action type determines the process Unity goes through to track your actions. Sound complicated so far? Let's dig deeper into the definition. Controlling the player is not as simple as it seems. You need to consider the following. Does the player need to press the button once for an action to be performed? Do they need to perform button smashing? Or do they need to hold a button for an action to be continuously performed? Based on your answer, you can easily choose an action type. Choosing the right action type will make it easier to achieve the desired gameplay behavior. There are 3 action types. They're called button, value, and pass-through. Each has its pros and cons. Let's go through each of them. The simplest action type is the button type. This type will listen for a button pressed once. I'm putting an emphasis on the word single. The button type does not care if the player holds down a button. Once the button has been pressed, the action is initiated. It is not initiated again until the button has been pressed a second time. This behavior is perfect for most scenarios. For example, a player can pause a game with a single button press. It would be awkward to force the player to hold down a button for the game to remain paused. In addition, this behavior can be desirable for games with button smashing. Mario Party has mini-games that require the player to repeatedly smash a button to win. Choosing the button type will be based on what you're trying to achieve in your game. The next 2 types are called value and pass-through. They're very similar to one another. Unlike the button type, these types will listen for a continuous button press. This behavior may be desirable for moving players. Players should move as long as a button is pressed. This brings us to the question, what's the difference between value and pass-through? Unity performs a process known as disambiguation. Alternatively, you may hear this process referred to as conflict resolution. Disambiguation is the process of deciding which controller should trigger an action. The input system supports multiple devices at once. If the player has 2 controllers tied to their system, how does Unity know which controller should trigger an action? Behind the scenes, Unity performs a few checks to make this decision. Disambiguation is performed with the value and button types. However, it's not performed with the pass-through type. If multiple devices are triggering the same action, all of them will cause the action to be activated. This behavior is the most significant difference between pass-through and the other types. Overall, here's a table summarizing what's possible with each type. Technically, you can use value and pass-through types to handle single button presses. However, it's common practice to use the button type. Hopefully, this summary helps you understand the differences between all types. Keep in mind, I've given you a simplified explanation of action types. If you're interested in a technical explanation, check out the resource section of this lecture. I provided a link to the official documentation page for action types. Feel free to check it out for more info. Let's head over to Unity to apply action types. For this course, we're going to be using the button and value action types. It's uncommon to use the pass-through action type. That's not to say it can't be helpful. There are use cases for this action type, which won't be explored in this course. The other types will be suitable for most scenarios. Disambiguation is preferred for most games. For example, what if a player drops one of their controllers? Or what if a player's pet steps on a controller they're not using? This could cause the game to behave unexpectedly. With disambiguation, this process can mostly be avoided. Let's go set the action types for each of our actions. Starting with the move action, set the action type to value. For movement, players should continuously hold down a button. It doesn't make sense to force players to repeatedly press a button to move. As long as they're holding down a button, they'll be able to move. Next, let's set the interact action to button. Players should be able to initiate dialogue with an NPC with the single press of a button. Let's use the button type for the attack, heal, and pause actions. Awesome! The actions for the gameplay action map are ready. Let's configure the UI actions. For these actions, they can all be set to button. Typically, menu systems require the player to press a button for each interaction. However, in some cases, you may want to allow continuous pressing. For our game, we're not going to go that far. The button type will suffice. We're one step closer to moving the player. In the next lecture, let's begin applying bindings to each action.